Welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton. My next guest is Laurence M. Vance. He's a publisher, author. He teaches Greek at Pensacola Bible Institute in Pensacola, Florida. He writes for LouRockwell.com. And he's the author of a great little book, a collection of essays called Christianity and War, and Other Essays Against the Warfare State. Welcome to the show, Mr. Vance.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. This is a great little book. I love it. 13 little essays that you wrote for LouRockwell.com.
Correct.
And it's published by your own publishing company, Vance
Right.
Publications, right? VancePublications.com is the web address there. And I'd actually read a lot of these essays before because I'm a regular reader of LouRockwell.com, but it's nice to be able to just kind of cruise right through, and you have it broken down into nice little sections and stuff. And the first section is called Christianity and War. And, you know, honestly, in fact, I think a couple of times when I mention that I'm going to interview the author of a book called Christianity and War, the assumption has been that you're anti-Christianity and that you're blaming Christianity for war because people immediately think that Christianity is a very warlike religion. You dispute that, sir?
Well, definitely, I would say it should be just the opposite. Christians should be opposed to war, and especially wars like the current unconstitutional, immoral war in Iraq that we have right now.
But isn't the common perception that there have been many wars throughout history fought in the name of Jesus Christ with massive casualties? Unfortunately,
that's true. And I'm sorry to have to admit that that's true, but it shouldn't be the case, and it should not have been the case, and it shouldn't be the case right now. So people can't just get hung up on the past. What's done is done, and it's too bad it happened. But no Christian that knows anything about the Bible at all and anything about history should be in favor of this fiasco in Iraq. That's for certain.
All right. Well, let's put off Iraq for a moment here. Pardon me. You quote an anonymous bishop or anonymous minister from 1838 saying Christianity cancels the laws of retaliation. What does that mean?
Well, if you, I assume you're referring to the article Christianity and War.
Right.
Where I quoted, it was an unsigned article from 1838 from a Baptist journal.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that's what you're referring to.
Right.
And if you read that article, he basically talks about how war is totally opposed to the peaceful nature of Christianity. Christianity teaches it's up to God to vengeance is mine, the Lord says. It's not for Christians to bring vengeance and to bring violence upon other people. It should be a religion of peace. And as he goes on to say in that article, war produces every woe known to man, and the causes of war are totally contrary to the gospel. So I wish I knew who that Baptist preacher was in 1838 that wrote that. I don't know why his name wasn't signed in that editorial. But the reason I brought that out is to show that Christian opposition to war is not just some new thing and is not just limited to Iraq. You can find Christians going back hundreds of years that were opposed to the state's wars before anybody ever heard of Iraq.
It's funny you bring up the just war doctrine to basically say it's not even really quite good enough, and you go ahead and define us Murray Rothbard's just war doctrine, which is a little bit more specific.
Yes, I'm a great admirer of Murray Rothbard. I know some Christians, they immediately dismiss Murray Rothbard because, of course, he was a Jew, he was an agnostic and not a Christian. But I think they're making a terrible mistake to dismiss a great thinker like that. People have this misconception that if someone says they're a Christian, then immediately what they say is okay, and then if someone is not a Christian, you shouldn't listen to them. And I think that's ridiculous because just just, I hate to bring up Iraq again, but President Bush all the time talks about his faith, and he's a man of faith, and there's been books written about what a great man of faith he is and what an example he is, and yet he's responsible for, I think it's 1,500 and something dead Americans right now.
Not to mention the tens of thousands of dead Iraqis.
Well, yeah, and unfortunately, the typical American is not interested in that at all. That doesn't mean anything. That's collateral damage.
Right. You talk about, you have a chapter called Falwell's Folly about Jerry Falwell, and an article he wrote called God is Pro-War. And rather than go through the fallacies of Jerry Falwell, I'd hate to give him that much attention in specific, but I am curious about Christian Zionism, and what is it about evangelical Christianity that seems to imply that the United States must support Israel no matter what?
Well, the Bible does say regarding the Jewish people, I will bless them that bless thee and curse them that curseth thee. And there are prophecies in the Old Testament regarding the establishment of the nation of Israel. But I believe a lot of these Christians are misguided in thinking that God needs our help, that God needs America to help intervene in the Middle East, because if we don't do that, somehow it's going to harm Israel. And I would take the opposite view and say that our intervention hurts Israel. Our intervention increases terrorism. Our intervention increases hatred of the U.S. and hatred for Israel. So I think Falwell is just totally off base, and especially this God is pro-war. What he means by that, as I mentioned in the article, is God is pro any American war.
Right.
If you were in Iraq, if you were a citizen of Iraq or some other country, or let's say Germany, Nazi Germany, you know, would you say God is pro-war and therefore he's in favor of the Third Reich attacking these other countries? Well, people say, well, that's a horrible example. Of course, God wouldn't be in favor of that. So what these people like Falwell really mean is God is pro any American war. Any other country that wars, they're of the devil. They're not anything to do with God. But if America has a war, then God is pro-American war. And I think that's totally ridiculous. God's no respecter of persons.
Right. All of us are fallen, right? None of us are good enough for him. Do you think, and this is an interesting point that a friend of mine brought up to me, I wonder if you think there's any credence to this, the idea that the nominal, people who call themselves Christians in America, that to a great degree they're very jealous of the Islamic world in the sense of Islamic devotion. I mean, many people in America call themselves Christians and, oh yeah, I believe in Jesus and this, that, but it's not really a part of their everyday life. And I wonder, well, the way my friend put it across to me was that perhaps a lot of these white American male Christians are actually a bit envious of the very true devotion that many Islamic people have to Allah.
Well, I'm sure that might be the case, because it makes them look bad when they talk about being a Christian and a follower of Christ, and then they go to church on Christmas and Easter, and they don't have any time for Jesus Christ the rest of the year. It does kind of look bad when you have these Muslims, and of course I believe their religion is totally wrong, but you cannot doubt the fact that they are sincere and they do seem to practice their religion. Whereas so many Christians in America, they don't practice their religion at all, except maybe at a funeral or except at Easter time.
Ouch. Well, I'm afraid that's true. And, you know, have you read Imperial Hubris by Michael Sawyer?
I recently purchased it, and I have not read it. I've seen some reviews on Lew Rockwell's site.
Right. Well, I'm sure you'll definitely enjoy it. One of the things that he says in there, and in fact, spends quite a bit of time explaining that bin Laden and his men are really not criminal mastermind types. They're actually, well, I don't know about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and some of those guys, but in bin Laden in particular, he describes him as a very pious guy. That the guy's really not evil, criminally insane murderer, but in fact, he's the most pious guy around, and that's why he's leading this insurgency, is because his true faith, he feels like, is being put under assault.
Well, I believe that he's also quoted as saying on September 11th that, he had nothing to do with these attacks. And I don't know that anyone has actually proved that he was behind it in the first place. But it sure helped his cause, and he took advantage of it. Right,
and he has said in speeches since then, hey, this is why we did it to you on September 11th, and that kind of thing. So, but, it is very interesting, I think, the idea that the Islamic fundamentalists generally look upon Christians as people of the book, that they have every respect for. They kind of wish that Christians would learn about the Prophet Muhammad or whatever, but they accept Jesus too, right? They just go a little further than that.
Yeah.
So, it's not like we're talking about the difference between Christianity and Hinduism or anything.
Correct.
This is all monotheism here.
And they all try to make some connection with Abraham in the Old Testament.
Right. Now, you have speaking of the Bible here, you have a quote on page 23 from 1 Samuel 8:9, where the Israelis are asking for a king, and God is trying to tell them they don't want one. You want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. The Jews said they wanted a king like all the other nations. And God said, basically, you don't want to do that. They said, we want to be like all the other nations, and we want our king to go out and fight battles and be like the other nations. So what they did is they forgot their heritage, where God set them apart from the nations and said that they weren't going to be numbered among the nations. So they made, of course, a horrible mistake. And in that passage in 1 Samuel, the Bible records how the king will appoint their sons to go out into war, basically a draft, I suppose. So, yeah, that was a terrible mistake that they made, wanting to follow these other nations and get a king.
You asked the important question in this book, should a Christian join the military? I think probably the majority of members of the U.S. military consider themselves Christians and consider, God and country and fighting for the American way and all that. Is it a bad thing for a Christian to join the U.S. Army?
Well, I'll tell you, that article right there that you mentioned, it's one thing to write about Christianity and war. It's one thing to criticize the Iraq War, to critique Falwell, or even to criticize the U.S. global empire. But once you challenge the state and its military, which is what I did in that article, Should a Christian Join the Military, that's when people come out of the woodwork and denounce you as anti-American, communist, unpatriotic, traitor. One fellow wrote me and said he was ashamed to be from the same country that I was. I would say in this day and age that the military is certainly no place for a Christian. Maybe at one time the military might have been something a Christian could serve in if the military was actually defending the country, but the military does not defend the country. The defenders of the country are the Border Patrol, the Coast Guard. Those are the defenders of the country. The U.S. military is simply the state's arm of aggression that intervenes in, as I document in other articles, intervenes in, hundreds of places around the world. So I would say a Christian shouldn't be in the military at all. I don't see how a Christian could be in the military and kill and bomb people for the state just because the state says they're evil, we're good, and you need to kill these people. I think that's ludicrous.
You say in your book that somebody dying and going to St. Peter might have a hard problem convincing him to get let inside the pearly gates. Well, yeah, I killed a lot of women and children, but George Bush told me to.
Yeah, I raised that point when a Christian stands before the judgment and they have to give an account for dropping bombs on some place in Iraq or slaughtering people in Fallujah, as happened recently. I mean, what's your defense going to be? George Bush told me I should go kill these people, so therefore I'm excused. It's okay. George Bush told me to do it. He was the president. I think that's ridiculous. I think Christians are going to have to answer directly to God when they give an account. And to try to fall back on George Bush and the government told me I should go do it, I don't think that's going to hold up in the eyes of a holy God.
Well, you actually bring this up, too, in the book, is that there is, or at least you quote somebody is bringing this up, that there's a difference to be made between thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not do murder. God doesn't send you to hell for accidentally dropping something on somebody's head, and he doesn't hold you responsible if you're fighting in legitimate self-defense, right? So
exactly.
So
and there's no way you can claim that killing someone, you know, thousands of miles away from the U.S. is just or an act of self-defense. It's all aggression is all it is. So it's totally undefendable.
Well, I can't say that I disagree with you, but I'm trying to put myself in the mind of a 17-year-old kid who doesn't know any better. Everybody around him is a Republican. He doesn't even know that anybody's anti-war or why they might be. And he goes and joins the military to fight for freedom. You have to hold him responsible as an individual, even though he's basically just a fool?
Well, certainly. I mean, the information is out there where anybody can get it, and it basically comes down to a moral situation. Can you put on a you know, what's so special about putting on a uniform and going 1,000 miles away and killing someone? You wouldn't think of killing your next-door neighbor just because you put on a uniform. So why is it any different if you put on a uniform and go 1,000 miles away and kill someone else's next-door neighbor? I just can't believe someone can be excused, you know, because of youth or ignorance.
All right, it's the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Laurence M. Vance. He's a publisher, an author. He teaches Greek. He writes for LouRockwell.com, and his little book is called Christianity and War and Other Essays Against the Warfare State. We'll be right back to wrap up after this break.
Son, leave your guns at home, Bill. Don't take your guns to town.
Here we go again, do the same old thing, but that's alright with me. Hanging out with the same old friends, but that's exactly where I wanna be. Everything's the same, I don't wanna change for nobody. Live life the way I want, just set it free. And that's right, it's my life, and I live it for no one but me. So you better take a case, take a friend on, and I'm in.
All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton. My website is weekendinterviewshow.com. Keep all the archives there in MP3 format for you to download. Also write for antiwar.com. And I'm talking with Laurence M. Vance. He's a publisher. In fact, the website of his publishing company is vancepublications.com. And he's an author. He teaches Greek at Pensacola Bible Institute in Pensacola, Florida, which is north and west enough Florida to be considered the South, not Florida,
right? By
the way. He writes for LouRockwell.com, and his book is called Christianity and War and Other Essays Against the Warfare State. And Mr. Vance, you spent a little bit of time in this book on the letters of a man named Brutus, who was opposed to the Constitution of the United States of America. Why was he opposed to the Constitution, and why did you cite him at such length in Christianity and War?
Well, Brutus is one of the great anti-federalist writers, and you don't hear much about the anti-federalists because, like you said, they were opposed to the Constitution because they thought that it was going to centralize too much power in the federal government and reduce the power of the states. And, of course, that's exactly what happened. But the Federalists won the debate. We got the Constitution. So you don't hear anything about the anti-federalists. But Brutus was one of the most prolific anti-federalist writers. And he wrote a lot against the evils of war, and that's And also standing armies, and that's what I have a large chapter in the book on that, a large essay in the book on the views of Brutus that you just don't hear about.
Well, and it turns out that he was exactly right, that if you allow them to have a standing army, they're going to find an excuse to get us into a war.
Of course.
I mean, we could go through and count the American wars. I think you, in the book, you quote Rothbard as saying 2 American wars were justified, the Revolutionary War, the First War of Secession from Great Britain, and the South's War of Secession against the North, and that's it.
Right.
Every other war has been unjust.
And what's interesting is on the subject of war, the anti-federalists like Brutus really were no different than the other founding fathers. And I have some other things in the book on Jefferson. The founding fathers were certainly opposed to us getting involved in wars away from the American continent. One of my favorite quotations is from Thomas Jefferson, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. And then I know most people are probably familiar with George Washington's warning about how having political connections with foreign nations and avoiding European wars. So the founding fathers, whether Federalist or anti-Federalist, are pretty well united on the folly of getting involved in these wars.
Right. Well, and then, like Jefferson said, the useless sacrifice of the generation of 1776 to be thrown away on the unwise and unworthy passions of their sons.
Correct.
Looks like they got away with it. All right. Thank you so much for this time today, Mr. Vance.
I appreciate you having me very much.
The book is called Christianity and War and Other Essays Against the Warfare State by Laurence M. Vance. He also writes for LewRockwell.com, L-E-W, Rockwell.com, and his publishing company is VancePublications.com. We'll be back next week, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.